Welcome back, fellow thinkers, common sense pioneers, and just plain folks who are beginning to be skeptical as to what we are being fed in terms of information on a daily basis. I'm Charles Wells, and you just tuned in to the Patriot Preacher. My channel is kind of a combination of things ranging from, what we can do to live a more fruitful personal life, to subjects that are designed to get people to think more critically about what they've learned either in school or through the corporate news media. What would come to your mind if I asked you what was the biggest scam to ever exist? It might be when people are contacted or contact you and say that they are from the IRS, and if you don't pay them some money immediately, you will go to jail. Or perhaps it's the scammers who pretend your social security number has been compromised. While these are certainly some notable and somewhat irritating scams, they have nothing on the biggest scam that has ever been perpetrated against mankind, and that is man-made global warming. Our children are being taught that we are destroying our planet in their classrooms, and politicians are wanting your hard-earned tax dollars to combat it, and companies routinely advertise ways to turn a profit from it. Everywhere it seems you look, people are touting man-made global warming as the single greatest threat to our survival on this planet. In fact, it is so embedded in our culture at this point that if you attempt to debunk this scam, you are attacked on all sides by people who haven't even taken the time to do some investigation on their own. You see, if you can inundate the public until they become so indoctrinated as to your way of thinking, you don't even have to fight your own fight. The army of believers that you've created will do that for you. And it is understandable. I think most people want in their hearts to do the right thing, regardless of what side of the political aisle that you land on when you get up in the morning from bed. No one wants to ruin our planet. After all, we and all of our children live here too. So let's start at the beginning. Nature never stays the same. Let me repeat that. Nature never stays the same. Nothing in nature is stagnant. Mountains rise and fall. Continents drift apart on tectonic plates and then come back together. Species appear and disappear, and the climate changes. In your next encounter with these pseudo-scientists, ask them exactly what is the ideal average temperature of the Earth, what it's supposed to be for life to exist on this planet as we know it, and how do we know we're not moving toward that ideal? We know that the Earth has gone through ice ages, and it has come back from them long before mankind was any kind of influence. There is evidence that during the 1400s we went through a warming period where grapes were grown in England. I lived in England for a while, and that's something that is certainly not possible today. And honestly, if we're moving in one direction or another, you better hope or pray that we are continuing to head away from an ice age rather than toward one. Life on this planet does not fare as well during the cooling periods as it does during the warming ones. I can tell you when I was growing up in the 70s, we were told by scientists then that we were heading to an ice age because the temperatures had been consistently cooling from the 1940s to the 1970s, when the greatest unfettered industrialized growth had occurred, when the opposite should have happened if mankind was indeed the cause of this malaise. And these scientists were just as certain back then as the ones you're hearing today that they were correct. The only difference is that back then there was relatively little money invested into green technologies to corrupt the scientific method. There was no 24-hour news channel. In fact, there were only 3 news channels, and you got a total of about 3 hours of news for each one each day. And another big bonus, there was no social media to help push narratives. This is certainly not the case today. Our government spends countless billions to either directly or indirectly combat this counterfeit threat. If you want a government grant to be approved for something that you're studying as a scientist, just add climate change to the study and chances are you will be approved. Climate change has become, in fact, a cottage industry. And wherever there is money involved, the scientific method that we were taught back in the 6th grade, make an observation, ask a question, make a hypothesis, draw conclusions, and report your findings, well, that just kind of goes out the window. According to these folks, if we have an unusual year with hurricane activity, it's because of climate change. If you don't have any hurricane activity at all, it's because of climate change. If your hemorrhoids hurt more than usual, it can somehow be attributed or linked to climate change. So the culprit, according to these folks, is carbon dioxide. Now, that seems to be a good place to start if we're going to talk about this whole thing. So if we're going to blame the end of the earth on this evil gaseous villain, then carbon dioxide, we should know how much it constitutes in our atmosphere. So carbon dioxide only constitutes about 0.04% of our atmosphere. That's about 1/25th of a percent for those of you who are quick on your mathematical feet. That means conversely that 99.96% of our atmosphere is not carbon dioxide. Add to that mankind is estimated to only contribute about 5% of the total carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, which means nature emits 95% of all emissions through the release of this gas from the oceans, volcanic activity, etc., etc. If you multiply these two, you get down to the point where we're only contributing 0.002% or 1/500th of a percent. So if we were to really get our act together as a unified planet and we're able to reduce our carbon footprint by half, we would have accomplished the big feat of reducing greenhouse gases by a whopping 1/1000th of a percent. Now, you have to ask yourself, does anyone listening actually think this would make a discernible difference, even if carbon dioxide were to turn out to be the culprit? Enough with the math. Calling carbon dioxide a naturally occurring trace element in our atmosphere that is necessary for life to exist on this planet as we know it, calling that a pollutant is like calling oxygen a pollutant. It's absurd. And while there is a correlation between carbon dioxide and warming, it is an inverse correlation or relationship. In other words, carbon dioxide doesn't cause temperature to rise. The temperature rises causes carbon dioxide levels to rise. And by the way, rising sea levels are also a critical part of this charade. The last time I checked, 90% of the world's ice is already submerged in the water, already taking up volume. And if you don't believe it, look at the glass of ice water that you're drinking next time that you have it in front of you. Additionally, there is an expanded volume because, as we know, ice takes up more space than water. Most instances where people are pointing to the existence of rising sea levels are really just instances where the land is sinking or natural erosion of the coastline is occurring. Remember, nature never stays the same. The truth, boys and girls, is that our earthly climate is a complex system created by interactions of energy transfers between the planet's atmosphere and the various land masses and bodies of water that make up its surface. The planetary climate has evolved under the influence of its own internal dynamics and variations in solar output. We get nearly all of our energy and heat from that little thing in the sky called the sun. It is also very big compared to us. In fact, 1,300,000 Earths can fit into the sun, and it burns at 10 million degrees at its surface. But of course, if we say that our warming trend is part of a larger cycle that involves the sun, we are committing blasphemy. Man-made global warming has now become a religion of sorts. We have been so routinely subjected to this false theory that most of us skeptics have just held up our hands and given up on trying to interject any common sense at all. And finally, folks, you might be asking yourself, why would such an effort to fool us even be undertaken? It's very simple. Like most things government does, it is about control. You see, all you have to do is create a crisis that is incredibly large, so large that only government can solve it. But in order to solve it, it requires your belief. It requires you to give up your comforts, even though the political elite don't. It requires money, and it requires you to give up some of your freedoms. These people who cannot even balance a budget are going to sit there and try to convince you that they can change or alter the course of climate on this planet. Lastly, being a part of things like the Paris Accord is an absolute nonsensical thing to do. All it does is subjugate American interests to other nations in the world, because that's exactly what treaties do. We only constitute 5% of the world's population, and we will have to pay for most of the world's climate crimes, even though countries like India and China, which constitute almost a third of the world's population, are given a complete pass because they are supposedly developing countries. And you have to ask yourself, does the climate really care if they are developing countries, if they are indeed polluting our planet into oblivion? It's finally come time for me to get off my high horse, friends and listeners. For those of you who remain true to your man-made global warming instincts, I hope I was able to at least give you some food for thought. For others who have already suspected that something underhanded was afoot, I hope that I have assisted you in heading in the right direction of enlightenment. If nothing else, it certainly makes for high drama, doesn't it? I will sign off for the moment. You have been watching another installment of the Patriot Preacher. I hope you've enjoyed our conversations. If so, please comment below and help boost the word by hitting that little subscribe button. And remember always to respect other people's opinions, even if you vehemently disagree with them. Until next time, goodbye and God bless.